Arabia's Bedouins are the hillbillies of the desert. Now, you might be wondering what the hell I'm talking about, but before you click off this video, give me a chance to explain. People from the American South have a lot in common with people from the Middle East. On the surface, they might seem completely different, but actually, there are a lot of similarities between the two cultures. There's a really good reason for this as well. It goes back over hundreds of years of history, but I'll get into that later. For now, let's just look at the things that these two groups of people have in common. First of all, people in the American South are deeply religious. The Bible Belt states consistently poll as the most religious in the country. Think pro-life, megachurches, etc. In the Middle East, 19 countries have Islam as their state religion, which guides political and personal life. Being non-religious in these countries is frowned upon, to say the least. Linked to religion, both cultures have conservative social values. Marriage, family, and protecting the clan, tribe, or other in-group comes first. People in both the American South and the Middle East find it important to practice kindness to strangers. Think about the trope of Southern hospitality. It's a real thing. And Middle Eastern households, they always work hard to make guests feel at home. We'll take a look at one example of this hospitality from history. Wilfred Thesiger was a British explorer who in 1946 went on an epic journey across the empty quarter of southern Arabia. The empty quarter is the world's largest continuous sand desert, and to get him across safely, he lived with the native people of the area, the Bedouins. He described their way of life and how important they found it to conduct themselves in a certain way. He called the Bedouins merciless critics of those who fall short in patience, good humor, generosity, loyalty, or courage. I think you can see something similar in the culture of the American South, with its hospitality, chivalry towards women, and emphasis on social decorum and etiquette, as described by Stanford neuroscientist Robert Sapolsky. Both the Middle East and American South are honor cultures. These people do not take insults lightly, and any attack on your reputation is expected to be met with retribution. People in these cultures are expected to take the law into their own hands, responding to insults, sometimes even with violence, rather than relying on governmental institutions to solve their problems for them. Let's look at another example of this. This comes from US Vice President J.D. Vance's memoir, Hillbilly Elegy. Now, whatever you think about him as a politician, I think the book does give a good insight into rural life in Breathitt, Kentucky. He writes, "The people of Breathitt hated certain things, and they didn't need the law to snuff them out." He tells the story of a man who was shot 16 times after allegedly raping a young girl, insulting her honor and that of her family. The authorities never investigated the killing. Let's look at another line from Thesiger talking about the honor culture of the Bedouins. If they think that their personal honor has been slighted, they immediately become vindictive, bent on vengeance. Strike a Bedou and he will kill you either then or later. In a really interesting look at the biological aspects of this honor culture, Sapolsky writes about a 1996 study which involved students doing blood tests and filling out questionnaires. They would then take the questionnaire to another room to drop it off, and as they're walking down the hallway, one of the researchers would bump into them and call them an asshole. They didn't know that this was part of the study. So they went and they got their blood tested again. And in subjects who came from the American South, researchers found that testosterone and glucocorticoids levels were hugely elevated, showing increased anger, rage, and stress. Students from the North of America did not have the same biological reaction. The cultures of both the Middle East and the American South place huge importance on family and lineage. Sapolsky writes about how the South traditionally emphasizes legacy, long cultural memory, and continuity of family. He points out how in rural Kentucky in the 1940s, 70% of men had the same first name as their father. That was far more than in the North. At the same time, Thesiger writes about how no race in the world prizes lineage so highly as the Arabs, and none has kept its blood so pure. I think at this point it's fair to say that there are a lot of similarities between these two groups of people. But how can two cultures, separated geographically by thousands of miles, how can they have so much in common? It seems unlikely that they were directly influenced by one another, given just the distance and how rare it might have been for them to interact with each other over the course of history. There is a theory that makes a lot of sense when you start to look into it. Let me explain. We've talked a little bit about religion already. Obviously, most American Southerners follow a different religion to most Middle Easterners. But that being said, both Christianity and Islam are monotheistic, Abrahamic religions, and despite the differences, they both draw on a lot of the same stories and source material which was born out of the ancient deserts of the Middle East. Just looking at that relationship between the desert and monotheism, there's a really interesting 1992 study by Ember which looks at how monotheistic religions usually develop among the cultures of what are called desert pastoralists. Now remember that word pastoralist. It's going to help us make sense of this connection between the American South and the Middle East. The study's authors write, "Deserts teach tough, singular things. A world reduced to simple, desiccated, furnace-blasted basics that are approached with a deep fatalism. I am the Lord your God, and there is but one God, and his name is Allah." Polytheistic religions, on the other hand, are more commonly found among people who live in tropical rainforests, which are teeming with life, where worshipping multiple gods makes more sense. The study goes on to look at how these desert pastoralists tend to develop cultures of honor, with strict rules of civility, courtesy, and hospitality. They also talk about how these cultures commonly place importance on taking retribution after personal insults, and how important they find it to uphold their reputation. If they take your camel today and you do nothing, tomorrow they will take the rest of your herd, plus your wives and daughters. Middle Eastern culture is born out of the desert, where conditions are harsh, and strict codes of personal conduct are sometimes the only way to survive. Fischer talks about this a little bit too. "All that is best in the Arabs has come to them from the desert," he wrote, giving examples of their devotion to religion, their fellowship among men, their personal pride, their hospitality to strangers, and their courage. So I think I've explained how much of Middle Eastern culture is influenced by the environmental factors of the desert. You might still be wondering how this has anything at all to do with the American South. Now I think the answer comes from David Fischer's book, Albion's Seed, which looks at how different colonial settlers to the US were influenced by the different regions of Britain from which they came. Fischer writes about the wave of migration to the backcountry of the American South in the 1700s, which came largely from the northern borders region, which is found at the intersection of England, Scotland, and the Irish Sea. More than 250,000 people transplanted their culture from this region into the American South. These people were proud, Fischer writes. They placed high value on honor, respect, and blood and clan relationships. They didn't trust legal institutions, and they tended to settle personal disputes with violence. Sound familiar at all? Like the Bedouins, they were fatalistic about the inevitability of death. The people from the northern borders region developed these characteristics because of environmental factors that they shared in common with the Bedouins. Now, the northern borders region of Britain wasn't quite a desert, but it was a sparsely populated and intensely harsh environment. People who lived there had a transient lifestyle, almost nomadic, unlike the more settled populations of southern Britain, who tended to migrate to the north of America and New England. Levels of property ownership were low, just like in the deserts of Arabia. Families and clans would just move a few miles down the road every few years in search of better conditions. This culture was taken with them when they moved from the northern borders region to the American South. An abundance of land there meant that many settlers could survive by herding animals that would graze freely, moving from place to place. And this kept their pastoralist culture alive. A surveyor for South Carolina wrote about these herders in 1773, saying they move like unto the ancient patriarchs or the modern Bedouins in Arabia from forest to forest. Life in the northern borders region was tough. It was a battleground for hundreds of years, as the kingdoms of England and Scotland fought over the land. This was a world where death could come at any moment, and it became more and more important to establish these tight bonds between families and clans just as a means of protection. The honor culture was developed out of survival. Living in this place, you didn't want to get a reputation for being a weakling, someone who couldn't stand up for themselves. These early settlers carried the culture with them. And this cultural migration can even be heard in Appalachian music. Listen to this whole ballad played here by Scottish musician Sam Shackleton.
I was forced from my homeland, I was made for to go. And I miss the purple heather and the grey mountains cold. Oh, I travelled over oceans and valleys so wide. Without you, darling Sarah, my love by my side.
I'd always wondered why these two cultures, that seem so different at first glance, actually share so much in common when you look into it. It turns out this didn't come out of nowhere. Both of these cultures developed in extremely difficult environments, where death was a part of everyday life, where institutions were ineffective or non-existent, where property and ownership was tenuous at best, where people moved from place to place and took everything they had with them. Protecting what you had meant survival. These pastoralist traditions helped them survive and flourish. The reason I find this so interesting is because I think it's an amazing example of how people from other sides of the planet are actually a lot more similar than you might think. But I want to hear your opinion too. If you enjoyed this video, if you found it interesting, leave a comment, like, and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.